Hello everyone to the day 9. Today we're going to talk about the access modifiers. Java is very fascinating. The same class, the same method could be visible to one and visible to not other. And for that we use the access modifier like public, private, protected, default. What are those? What are their significance? How do we use them? All of that we're going to understand in this video. Let's get started. So let's talk about the method visibility, and as such the term called as the access modifier itself. So normally if I go and talk about access modifier, let's open this here. If I go and talk about access modifiers, at the term itself says modifiers. So these are typically the keywords which goes and tells that how should be the visibility of the given section of the code. So normally in Java, the access modifiers are applied to the multiple entities. Few of the places where access modifiers could be applied are, for example, they are applied at the class level. Number 2, they could be applied at the methods level, which we are seeing right now. They are applied at the fields level, right? And then they are also applied at something called as a constructor. Now, don't get too much panicked because of this new introduction of the term called as a constructor. We'll talk about that in the later part of the today's session. So right now you are already aware of these terms like class, methods and fields, but we also know that access modifiers could be used with the constructors. Now if I go and talk about, this is where they are applied. If I go and this is where they are applied. But I also have to go and know what are the types of the access modifier. What are the different types? So the access modifier that you have already seen are like, you have seen access modifier like, for example, public, which you have already seen. The second one is where you have not seen anything, default. When you default. Default means that you don't provide anything. For example, in the previous case, if I go and open the Eclipse, and you see here in the class 1, I didn't provide anything. So I go and say that this method, here in this case, I will go and say that this method has default access modifier. Okay, that's the whole meaning. Fair? Now if I go back here, there's something is called default. Third one, which is a new term which we are going to introduce right now, is called as protected, and the fourth one is called as private. Now here, with all the things that we have already learned so far, we can go and understand public in detail, we can go and understand default in details. Protected requires a concept of inner classes. Again a new term, so I'll just wait for you to first understand what inner classes and then talk about this protected, and then finally the private. But this is a good question. Mostly with the freshers, if someone has to ask you a question, they will ask you a question that what is a public, what is default, what is protected, what is private, what are the difference between all of these. So with this practical example that we're going to do, I'm pretty sure that you'll be able to understand that well. Keep in mind, because this is again a high chance or high probability question that could be asked in the interview. Now let's get started and understand these things in detail. So let me go to my Eclipse, and the Eclipse, we start with the same thing, right? We have a class 1, right? Let me go and use a prefix here called as, let me use another classes. Let me go and define a class called as class A. Now just so that it doesn't give you any error, let me go and call this class 3 as public. Let's go back, I'm just trying to resolve the error. I have a class A, and inside this class A I have a method. Let me go and call this method as public static void. Let me, instead of using public, let me start with something called as private static void, and let me go and say that method A, right? And I'm going to say this out, and I'm going to call it as hello from method A. This is how I'm going to write it. Now, as soon as you make private, Eclipse is very smart, right? It has started showing you some kind of hint. If you go and click on this, it will going to give you certain warnings, right? So if I go and do this, hover over this, it will give you certain suggestions. It says remove method A, add suppress unused method A, configure problem severity. Because I'm not used this method A, it's giving me all these kind of warnings. So if it is a private method, let me go and call a public static void main string args, and if I want, I can go and call this method. I go and call this method A, and then I go and pass this, and if I go and run this, this is working all fine. So I go and define a method which is private. I went ahead and define a method which is a private, right? And I'm able to call this method. This is method A, and I'm able to call this method inside this. So this is working perfectly. Great, that's awesome. Now, let me try to go and call this method inside the another class called as class B. So if I go and define another class B here, I'm going to define class B. Class B, and I'm going to select public static void main method. Click on the finish, and inside this, let me go and call something called as class A dot. And what was the method in the class A? The method in the class A was method A. We're going to call this print enter. If you do this, you see that there is a compilation error. So when you make a method private, when you make a method private like this, it can only be visible in the same class. Outside the class, as soon as you go, you cannot go and see it. So when you go and make a method private, as soon as you go and make the method private, what happens? It's only visible inside the class. As soon as you go outside the class, this method will not be visible. Sometimes it makes sense, right? You would like to go and define a method which could be only used with the context of the given class itself, and that's when you go and make use of private methods, right? So before you use a prefix like private before any method, you have to be double sure that why you are trying to use that, and mostly we'll use it when we have some personal use method, which I feel that no other class will require it. I'll go and make use of a keyword called as private. Fair enough. Now in the same example, at this moment of time, if I go and remove, let's say before method, let's also talk about the field itself. So if I go and define a field called as private static string name equals to class A, let's assume that. Now I can go and access this inside this public static void main. For example, if I go and do that sys out and I go and pass name, it will print. It's print. But in the class B, if I go and try to go and call this as class A, I will not have this, if I go and forcefully try to call this name and save enter, again it is giving me the error compilation. It's not possible, right? So we understood if you make any field as private, or if you make any method as private, it could be only called from the same class. If we move to the another class, it's very tough. You cannot, very tough, it's not possible to go and call those methods or the fields. Now if you make a small change into this, right, if you just remove this keyword called as private from here, and we also remove the keyword private from here, and save this. As soon as we did it, and I go to the class B, right? So it's a class A and this is a class B. I'm seeing that this error is gone, but if I come here, I still see there's an error, right? If you just hover over it, I see a value. Assign recipient to a new local variable. So basically I'm getting a name, I'm not using it, that's why it's giving me an error. So I can simply go and say that string name equals to class A.name. So when I did this, when I don't provide any kind of prefix around this access modifier, these are called as the default access modifier. It means that you have not provided anything public, private, anything, right? It's all default. So when it is a default, it is shown up in the next class. So it is available in the class B itself, right? So if I go to the class B, it's gone. Let me go and save this. If I go and try to run this, it works as expected. Fair enough. Let me go and define another class called as a class C. Let me go and define another class called as a class C, and I finish it. And inside that I go and say that PA public static void main string args. And now I have to go and call this, let's say for example class A content here, right? So I have to first of all, we have already seen, we'll have to first of all go and import. So I go and say that import, and I'll go and say that com.image, and then I'll go and say that class A. Now class A has a method called as method A. If we go and call this, and also if I go and say that string name equals to class A dot name, this was the variable class A, variable name was name. You go and see that both of these are giving me error. Both of these are giving me the error. So when you go and make use of default access modifier, right, the output is that visibility is only inside the, visibility is only present inside the package. Outside the package, not visible. Outside the package, it is not visible. So if you have to make this visible outside the given package, you will have to explicitly go and say that, dude, you have to be public. You have to be public. So inside the class A, I have to go and make this as public, right? And if I go and save this now, and then run this class C again, I see the error has gone. If I go and run this, this will hello from the method in class A. So with this, if I go and try to do a quick summary, so the strongest rule is for the private keyword, right? When you go and make use of the private, they are the strongest. And when I go and say the strongest, typically the private is applied at the class level. As soon as you go and come out of the class, no one will be able to see it. Then there is something called as a default. Default is a little more lenient, right? And its visibility is at package level. There will be no visibility in external packages, right? And then third one which we saw was the completely open, which is public, which is visible from all the places. Now, apart from all these three, there is one more which is called as protected. Now, this involves the concept of inner classes. Inner classes. So we'll take it again, but as of now, just for the completion, I'll tell you. Protected, when it is used, its visibility is extended to the external package with the use of inner class. But what is an inner class? How it has to be used? You don't have to worry, because we'll talk about that as we make progress. So with this, we have understood the different types of the access modifier. What impact does it has on the fields and the methods? Now, when it comes about the classes, sir, with the classes, the external classes, the high level, the top level classes, you can only make use of either public or you can make use of default. It doesn't make sense that a top level class you make it private or the protected. So for the classes, it could be only either public or the default. But if it is an inner class, and what inner class, I have already talked a lot about it, but we'll talk in detail around it. When I go and talk about the inner classes, they could be private, they could be protected, they could be public, or they could be default. They could be any of these. So finally, the day 9 video is done. We have completed the access modifier. I hope you have a good experience here. There's a very high chance that interviewers can ask you questions from this topic. If you're liking this series, if you're enjoying your time, make sure that you're writing the comments, you're sharing over the LinkedIn, other social media handles, so that it allows us to make a big community where we go learn and grow together. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you again next tomorrow with the video 10.